Hello, and welcome to the To Be Like Christ Bible Study podcast, where we explore and explain one chapter of the Bible at a time. My name is Luke, and I am thy host, and today's chapter is Genesis 38. Let's go ahead and read the chapter together. I'm going to be reading from the English Standard Version of the Bible, and while I find it in my Bible, if you have a moment, hit the subscribe button on your podcast player so we can study together again sometime. Genesis 38 has 30 verses. Let's read it. It happened at that time that Judah went down from his brothers and turned aside to a certain Adulamite, whose name was Hira. There Judah saw the daughter of a certain Canaanite, whose name was Shua. He took her and went into her, and she conceived and bore a son, and he called his name She conceived again and bore a son, and she called his name Onan. Yet again she bore a son, and she called his name Shelah. Judah was in Chezib when she bore him. And Judah took a wife for his firstborn, and her name was Tamar. But Judah's firstborn, was wicked in the sight of the Lord, and the Lord put him to death. Then Judah said to Onan, "Go in to your brother's wife and perform the duty of a brother-in-law to her, and raise up offspring for your brother." But Onan knew that the offspring would not be his, so whenever he went in to his brother's wife, he would waste the semen on the ground, so as not to give offspring to his brother. And what he did was wicked in the sight of the Lord, and he put him to death also. Then Judah said to Tamar, "Remain a widow in your father's house till Shelah my son grows up," for he feared that he would die like his brothers. So Tamar went and remained in her father's house. In the course of time, the wife of Judah, Shua's daughter, died. When Judah was comforted, he went up to Timnah to his sheep shearers, he and his friend Hira the Adulamite. And when Tamar was told, "Your father-in-law is going up to Timnah to shear his sheep," she took off her widow's garments and covered herself with a veil, wrapping herself up, and sat at the entrance of Enaim, which is on the road to Timnah. For she saw that Shelah was grown up, and she had not been given to him in marriage. When Judah saw her, he thought she was a prostitute, for she had covered her face. He turned to her on the roadside and said, "Come, let me come in to you," for he did not know that she was his daughter-in-law. She said, "What will you give me that you may come in to me?" And he answered, "I will send you a young goat from the flock." And she said, "If you give me a pledge until you send it." And he said, "What pledge shall I give you?" She replied, "Your signet and your cord and your staff that is in your hand." So he gave them to her and went in to her, and she conceived by him. Then she arose and went away, and taking off her veil, she put on the garments of her widowhood. When Judah sent the young goat by his friend the Adulamite to take back the pledge from the woman's hand, he did not find her. And he asked the men of the place, "Where is the cult prostitute who was at Enaim on the roadside?" And they said, "No cult prostitute has been here." So he returned to Judah and said, "I have not found her." Also, the men of the place said, "No cult prostitute has been here." And Judah replied, "Let her keep the things as her own, or we shall be laughed at. You see, I sent this young goat, and you did not find her." About 3 months later, Judah was told, "Tamar, your daughter-in-law, has been immoral. Moreover, she is pregnant by immorality." And Judah said, "Bring her out, and let her be burned." As she was being brought out, she sent word to her father-in-law, "By the man to whom these belong, I am pregnant." And she said, "Please identify whose these are, the signet and the cord and the staff." Then Judah identified them and said, "She is more righteous than I, since I did not give her to my son Shelah." And he did not know her again. When the time of her labor came, there was twins in her womb. And when she was in labor, one put out a hand, and the midwife took and tied a scarlet thread on his hand, saying, "This one came out first." But as he drew back his hand, behold, his brother came out. And she said, "What a breach you have made for yourself." Therefore his name was called Perez. Afterwards, his brother came out with the scarlet thread on his hand, and his name was called Zerah. So that's the text of Genesis chapter 38. This is kind of an aside story, if you will, from the story of Joseph. I told you in the last chapter that we were going to be talking about Joseph, really from chapter 37 to the end of the book of Genesis, but this story kind of steps aside just for a moment to talk about Judah, Jacob's fourth oldest boy, and these events that occur in his life. And we'll talk about why this aside exists and why this story is recorded in the Bible, at least part of the reason, later on after our outline. So we'll set that aside for now, but let's remind ourselves of the context. In chapter 37, we were kind of reintroduced to Joseph, who at that time was 17 years old, and he was hated by his brothers because he was his father's favorite. And also sometimes he brought back bad reports about his brother's shepherding performance to his father. And so he was certainly not the favorite. He also had these dreams about his brothers bowing down to him. And his brothers just think that this is his own arrogance and his own pride. But we talked about how those eventually will be discovered to be prophetic dreams. But we haven't discovered exactly how yet, especially because at the end of chapter 37, Joseph isn't somebody that anyone would bow down to. He's sold off by his brothers to be a slave in Egypt. So he's on his way to the southwest about 500 miles, now being sold into slavery. And we were told that he was sold to a man named Potiphar, a guard, or rather a captain of Pharaoh. And so that's where he is in Egypt. That's the end of chapter 37. But now we're going to talk about Judah for one chapter before we return back to the story of Joseph in Egypt. If you would like, you can download our PDF that has all the summarized information for these studies on it on our website. It's totally free, all 50 chapters of the book of Genesis. Also, if you'd like those chapters and those outlines in a book form, you can get one on Amazon.com. Just search for To Be Like Christ Genesis, and it's under our 5-minute Bible study series. And let me encourage you again, if you haven't already, if you're on a podcast platform that allows you to leave ratings, if you leave this podcast a 5-star review or 5-star rating, that would be fantastic. It really helps us to grow and to be recognized as something worth listening to. At least that's what I'm aspiring to be. So if you would do that, and likes and comments and shares of this on other platforms are always appreciated. Let's go ahead now and get into our first couple sections covering when, who, and where of this chapter. First up is when. When did these events take place? Genesis 38:1 begins with the phrase, quote, "It happened at that time." Well, at what time? Well, it would seem that it's referencing back to the end of chapter 37, which was the selling of Joseph into slavery in Egypt. So it appears that the events of chapter 38 begin around the time that Joseph was sold into slavery. But keep in mind that the totality of the events that are discussed in Genesis 38 likely span a few decades. So we're covering quite a bit of time here. Joseph was sold into slavery in Egypt around 1728 BC. So you can kind of use that as a reference point. So this takes us to our main character section. As I mentioned, we're not going to be focused on Joseph here. We're going to be focused on his older brother, Judah. This is Jacob's fourth son with Leah, his wife. We're also going to talk about some of Judah's sons. Judah had 3 sons that are mentioned in this chapter with a Canaanite woman. Their names were Onan, and Shelah. And then our third main figure in this chapter is Tamar. She was Judah's daughter-in-law who was originally married to his son So now let's go to our map and talk about where these events happened, geographically speaking. I would definitely encourage you to grab the map that is on the PDF for this one, because these 2 cities, we're not going to talk about them a lot, and they're not ones that we've talked about before, so they're kind of standing out here a little bit, but you will see them highlighted on the custom map that we have on our outline. Judah seems to be living in and around the area of Chezib when his 3rd son was born, and Judah went to Timnah to shear his sheep in this chapter. These 2 locations are pretty close to each other. They are northwest of the city of Hebron, and they are almost due west of the city of Bethlehem, maybe about 15 miles. We've talked about Bethlehem. Remember, that's where Rachel was buried, but they are moving over towards the west side of Canaan, getting closer to the Mediterranean Sea. So if you're at the very top of the Dead Sea and you go 30 miles or so due west, you'll run into Chezib and Timnah. I think that's verbally the best that I can explain where exactly these places are. With those 3 sections finished up, let's now go ahead and get into our 30 verses, into our outline section, break the chapter down, and try to make sure that we understand what we just read. Our first section is verses 1 through 11, Judah's sons and Tamar's dilemma. Judah, one of the sons of Jacob, married a Canaanite woman, and she bore 3 sons with him, and their names were Onan, and Shelah. Probably some people say Shelah, but we're going to say Shelah. Onan, and Shelah. Now, this is interesting, and there's no comment made about this in the text, but it's interesting that Judah goes ahead and marries one of the women of the land, a Canaanite woman. After Abraham and Isaac and Jacob had gone through so much trouble not to marry one of the Canaanite women, Judah just goes ahead and starts intermixing with the women of the land. Again, we don't have a comment about this. We don't have a comment from God as to what he thought about this, but that's just something to point out, and maybe it had something to do with the way that some of Judah's sons turned out, which we'll read about that in just a second. So he marries a Canaanite, and he has these 3 sons, Onan, and Shelah. And try to remember that order because it becomes important. Onan, Shelah. Judah found a woman named Tamar to be his oldest wife. So they get married, and Tamar. But we're told that was, quote, wicked in the sight of the Lord, and God killed him. God put him to death. We don't know how, we don't know the details of it, but he was so evil that God killed him. Judah then told his middle child, Onan, to fulfill his role as a brother-in-law and to have children with Tamar, his older brother's widow, so that his brother's family line would be able to continue, so it wouldn't end with Now, I think this merits a little bit of explanation because there is no such custom or command in our modern culture. I'm not aware of any culture that does anything similar to this, although there might be some out there. Let's skip ahead a little bit in time to a guy named Moses. God is going to give his moral law for the Israelite nation to a man named Moses, and God's moral laws are kind of going to be codified. They're going to be written down, and you can read about a lot of those in Exodus and Leviticus and Deuteronomy. Within those laws, we see this very thing, this very responsibility that Judah is telling Onan to fulfill. It was instructed by God. This is sometimes called the Levirate law, although I don't think that's a biblical term, but that's what it's come to be known. If your older brother died and he was married, and him and his wife didn't have any children to carry forward their name, then the younger siblings were responsible for marrying the widow of their older brother, having children with her, and those children would not be considered heirs of their own. They would not be considered their own descendants, but they would actually be considered the descendants of the dead brother. Okay, so maybe to make that a little bit more clear, I'm the middle son in my family. We have three boys. I'm the middle. My brother is married. If he died and didn't have any children with his wife, it would be my responsibility then to take his wife and to have offspring with her, have children with her, and those children would be considered my older brothers, even though he was dead. And that way, his name could carry on. And as I mentioned, this was actually commanded in God's law for the Israelites. But what we find out here, this is before Moses ever received that law. Moses hasn't even been born yet, and we're not going to get to him till the book of Exodus. What we find is that this law, this moral responsibility, existed even before it was codified in that law that was given to Moses. And so Judah is telling his middle son Onan to fulfill his moral responsibility to his dead brother and to his widow, to go into his widow and to have children so that his brother's line can continue. And I think this is a good moment to mention something that's key for interpreting the Bible in some of these early chapters, and that is that God gave moral instructions to many of these ancient people that we just don't read about. The Bible doesn't record them for us. We learn about this in cases like Jacob and Esau. Not Jacob and Esau. I always get them mixed up with Cain and Abel. Cain and Abel, you remember them? They offer sacrifices to the Lord, but Cain's offering is not pleasing to the Lord, but Abel's was. How did they know how to make offerings? We don't read any instructions about how to make sacrifices back in those days. Well, God must have communicated some instructions to them that we just don't have written down. We also see this in like a case of like Melchizedek, who's in Genesis, 14, I believe, and his interactions with Abraham. Melchizedek is a priest of God. But prior to Melchizedek, we don't read any instructions from God about how you become a priest or what the roles of a priest are during those days. But God obviously communicated those things to them, and we don't have record of them. And I think that's exactly what's going on here. This law that's eventually going to be codified in the law of Moses was already something that God had communicated to his people even before he wrote it down in the law of Moses. So Judah knew somehow, some way, that it was his middle son's responsibility to have children with his dead brother's widow and to raise up children in his brother's name. So that's what he tells Onan to do. You go in, you go fulfill this responsibility. It is your duty. So now we're going to see how Onan handles his responsibility. What we find out is that Onan, whenever he slept with Tamar, spilled his semen on the ground because he knew that the offspring would not be considered his own, they would be considered his brother's. So he seems so selfish that he doesn't want to raise up offspring in his brother's name. He wants these children to be in his own name, so he's going to deprive his dead brother of an heir, and he's also going to deprive his sister-in-law or his brother's widow of an heir. What does God think of this? And this is how we know that this was an instruction that came from the Lord. God killed Onan because he didn't fulfill his duty to his deceased brother and to his wife. So God took this very seriously, and now Judah's two oldest sons, and Onan, have both been killed by the Lord for being wicked and disobeying God's instructions. Jacob then goes to Tamar, and he tells her to remain a widow until his youngest son, Shelah, grows up. And then he will give Tamar to his youngest son, Shelah, and they'll try again for the third time. Shelah evidently was too young to get married at this point, and so there's some time that has to pass here. So this brings us to section number 2, verses 12 through 23. Tamar tricks Judah. And she tricks him because it's the only way for her to get what is due to her. We're told that as time passes, in the course of time, Judah's wife died. And Shelah, this youngest son of Judah, he grows up. He becomes marriageable age. But Judah breaks his promise to Tamar. He doesn't give Shelah to Tamar as he had promised. When Tamar learned that Judah was going to this place, Timnah, to shear his sheep, she kind of takes things into her own hands. She disguises herself as a prostitute, and she waits along the road to Timnah. Remember, in verse 12, we're told that Judah's wife has died some time ago. And so Judah then comes by where Tamar is located, and he's interested in her services, shall we say. And he hires her. And what he does is that he says, I'll pay you with a young goat from my flock. That'll be the payment for this activity. And she says, well, you don't have the goat with you right now. And so what can you give me kind of as collateral until you send the goat? So he gives her his signet, like a marker of his identity, a cord, and his staff that he was carrying. And so then Judah goes in and he has relations with Tamar, and she becomes pregnant. Now keep in mind, he doesn't know that this is Tamar. The text says that she veils her face. So he just thinks that this is a prostitute who he's paying and kind of satisfying himself with, but it's actually his daughter-in-law. The daughter-in-law that he has lied to and not kept his promises to, and he has deprived of having any children because he won't give his youngest son to her. So he sleeps with her and she becomes pregnant. She conceives a child. And he didn't discover during this whole event who she was. And so then they go their separate ways, and Judah thinks nothing has happened, but Tamar knows better. Judah later sends his friend to make the payment to this supposed prostitute of this young goat and to get back his signet and staff and cord. But when he goes with the young goat to find her, assuming that she would be in the same spot doing business, they can't find her. And so they can't give her the goat. She leaves with Jacob's cord and staff and signet. And so they're kind of confused about this, as why she didn't wait around for her payment. But they just kind of say, well, maybe she went off somewhere else and who knows where she went. And so it's not a big deal. Well, turns out it is a big deal. And it's a clever move by Tamar here. This brings us to section number 3, verses 24 through 30. Tamar's pregnancy is discovered and Judah is shamed. So 3 months later, when Jacob is at home, it's discovered that Tamar is pregnant. And Judah's actions are interesting here as he plays the hypocrite, and they'll come back to bite him in just a second. But Judah assumes that she has just been immoral, that she has just slept with some random man, maybe some Canaanite man, and now she is pregnant by this random man, and that this is a horrible immorality. And so he tells his family that she needs to be brought out and burned. So he's ready to kill her for her immorality. But this is where her scheme is revealed. Tamar reveals the man who she is pregnant by, and she reveals that it's by Judah that she's pregnant, her own father-in-law. How does she prove this? Well, she still has possession of his signet, his cord, and his staff. And as she's being brought out to be burned, she hands over these three things, and she says, it's by this man that you can find, or it's by these items that you can find out the man that I'm pregnant by. And these things are brought to Judah, and he's like, oh no, I've been busted. And he, to his credit, he admits that he's wrong. And he admits actually that Tamar is more righteous than him in this situation because it's his sin that started this whole thing. This is a quote from the text, "She is more righteous than I, since I did not give her to my son Shelah." He had promised to give Tamar his youngest son, and when Tamar realized that that was a lie, she takes things into her own hands. She comes up with this scheme. She bears a son, but she bears it through Judah. And so Judah's hypocrisy is caught here, and he admits, this is my fault, and whatever guilt here that is to go around, it's really on me for my failures. And so he definitely failed in the upbringing of his children and in his promise to Tamar, but at least he confesses it here, and he acknowledges that he was wrong all along. And so Tamar, of course, is not burned at the stake or whatever was going to happen to her. Judah has to bear his shame and confess that the guilt falls on his shoulders. So Tamar has her sons that she needed all along. They just came in a different way than what was expected. Tamar gave birth to 2 twin boys and named them Perez and Zerah. And I mentioned at the beginning of this chapter that we were going to talk about why this story is in the Bible. Why do we take a break from Joseph, who's kind of the main character here? And why do we go over here to Judah to read about this kind of awful story? Why is this important? And the reason is, in part at least, is because when we read Matthew chapter 1 and we read the genealogy of Jesus, Tamar is actually listed in that genealogy. And so it's beneficial to have this history to understand the family of Jesus and where he's coming from. We've already talked that he's going to be a descendant of Judah. So it's through Judah's household that eventually the Messiah will come to save the world of sin. But what we see, and one thing that's really interesting, is that the family line of the Messiah is certainly not perfect. We see that in Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, and now we see it in Judah, and we see it in his sons. And it just brings us back to that same point that we've been discussing many, many times. The Bible story is not about how righteous these men were and how we need to look up to them. It's pointing us to the one who comes who actually is worthy of our admiration, and that is to Jesus. But even Jesus comes into the world through an imperfect family. Even his own family needs saved by the sacrifice that he makes on the cross. So that is our summary for today. That is the summary of chapter 38. Before we finish, let's talk application. I think there's a pretty obvious application from the character of Judah here, and that is, don't be a person who is quick to point out other people's sins without addressing your own sins first. Judah was really quick to demand a harsh punishment for the sin that he assumed Tamar had committed, but he failed to address his own sins of withholding his son from her. Now, I think we all have to admit that it usually is easier to see other people's shortcomings. It's easier to see those than our own. But we need to be conscious of our own weaknesses if we want to avoid playing the hypocrite like Judah did in this chapter. Probably few things more shameful than trying to call out other people's sins with vigor and zeal, and in the process having your own sins laid bare in front of everybody, and you looking like a complete fool in front of everybody. That's what happened to Judah here. We don't want that to happen to ourselves, not because we're trying to protect ourselves from shame, but because we want to be upright people. So there you have it. That is Genesis 38 and the application that I've selected from the chapter. If you have any other applications, let me know down in the comments section, and we will talk about Genesis 39 and return to the story of Joseph in our next chapter. We're going to leave Canaan for a while, and we're going to go down to Egypt. So that's quite exciting as we get Joseph's story moving forward a little bit more, and we're going to see how God works through him and how God uses him to change the trajectory of his 11 brothers, of his father, of his entire family, and the entire trajectory of the nation that will be the nation of Israel.